Welcome to another deep dive with the Observer Group. We've got a lot to cover this week, Southern California. Really a fascinating snapshot of where we are as a nation right now. Everything from what's happening with federal policies to really just the everyday fight for fairness and opportunity.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
Absolutely, and we're going to do just that. We've got a stack of articles from across the Observer Group newspapers, and today our goal, like always, is to help you cut through the noise. We'll pull out what really matters, make sense of it all, and see what it might mean for you.
Yeah. It's about connecting those dots, right? So you
Mhm.
see the bigger trends, understand those consequences, and really just zero in on what you need to know.
So what's on our radar this week? 5 key stories from the Observer Group newspapers. We're going to start by diving into some major federal job cuts at the Department of Education. We want to look at, well, what's behind them and who might be affected. Then we'll shift gears to really the ongoing and complex situation facing black homeowners. Then we've got news of a kind of an interesting debt relief initiative from Experian, this time targeted at African Americans in Louisiana. And of course, this being Women's History Month, we're going to take a moment to celebrate the incredible Joyce Richardson. And finally, we'll end with really a look at a pretty revealing report on the experiences of black women in California workplaces. Quite a landscape we're covering today.
Yeah, no shortage of important topics, that's for sure. And each of these stories really offers such a critical lens on different aspects of our society right now.
All right, well, let's jump right into it then, shall we? Our first deep dive takes us straight to Washington, D.C. with some, well, pretty big news about job cuts at the Department of Education. And I mean, from the looks of it, this sounds like a pretty fundamental shift.
It does. The core of the news here is that the Trump administration, along with the Department of Government Efficiency, which, by the way, is now headed by Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I'm sure you saw that in the headlines. Well, they've started making some serious cuts at the Department of Education. We're talking over 1,300 jobs.
Over 1,300. That's, I mean, wow. Immediately, your mind goes to the individuals and families, right? And it wasn't just about reducing numbers remotely either, was it? They also made some pretty significant changes to the department's physical presence.
Exactly. So they're shutting down those regional offices in major cities. We're talking New York, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland. And the way it happened was, honestly, kind of abrupt. Employees got an email on Tuesday, and then boom, Washington headquarters and those regional offices, they all closed down on Wednesday, they said, for security reasons, and reopened on Thursday. So the whole thing seems like it was pretty rapid and maybe even a bit unsettling for the people involved.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what's the official reason for all of this? What's the administration saying?
Well, according to Education Secretary Linda McMahon, it all comes down to efficiency, accountability, and making sure that resources are directed where they matter most, to students, parents, and teachers. That's the message they're putting out there.
Okay, so streamlined, efficient, focus on the core mission. Sounds good on paper, but what's the bigger picture here? What's really driving this, you think?
Well, if you take a step back and look at the context, this really falls in line with the Trump administration's, and let's be honest, Trump himself has always wanted to shrink the federal government. And there's even talk, longer term of getting rid of the Department of Education altogether. Of course, that would take Congress getting on board, which, well, that adds a whole other layer of complexity. So it's not just about numbers, right? It's about potentially a whole philosophical shift, less federal involvement. But then you got to think, what happens to those communities that rely on those federal programs, especially those already underserved? There's a real risk there.
A lot of questions to consider. And these job cuts, we're not talking about everyone being let go in the same way, right? The article mentioned a few different ways people were leaving the department.
That's right. So those 1,300, those are what they're calling official layoffs. So they'll be terminated in 90 days, and they get severance pay based on how long they've been there. On top of that, 63 probationary employees, they were let go last month under a White House directive. Then there were over 300 buyouts offered, could get up to $25,000, and 260 employees decided to take deferred resignation. So they definitely used a few different strategies to really cut down the workforce.
And it sounds like Secretary McMahon has made it very clear this is just the first wave, right?
Exactly. She said it point blank, quote, just the beginning. So it seems pretty safe to say we can expect to see even more reductions, both in terms of the size of the department and what they do.
Now, as you can imagine, this has sparked some pretty strong reactions. Former Education Secretary Arne Duncan, He was pretty vocal about his concerns, wasn't he?
Yeah, he didn't mince words. Arne Duncan, who was the education secretary under Obama, called these cuts a direct threat to vulnerable students, especially in Black and brown communities. He's also really worried about the impact on equal access to education, says it could be extraordinarily damaging and detrimental. So you've got two very different ways of looking at this. The current administration says streamlining, necessary cuts. Former Secretary Duncan says harmful, direct threat, shows just how much disagreement there is about the role of the federal government in education.
Yeah, that's a stark contrast. So what's behind his concern? What exactly does the Department of Education do to ensure equal access that these cuts might put at risk?
Well, the department's got a few really important jobs when it comes to making sure everyone has a fair shot at education. They're responsible for enforcing those civil rights protections that are laid out in things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, no discrimination based on race, sex, disability, that kind of thing. They also run those big federal programs like Pell Grants, which help low-income students afford college. They provide support for students with disabilities, different initiatives and programs. And they give a lot of money to schools that are in high poverty areas. So if they cut back, it could directly hit those essential functions and the people who depend on them.
It does seem like there's also an ideological component to all of this. The article mentioned something about Trump's 2024 platform.
Yeah, in his platform, Trump actually calls the Department of Education a woke bureaucracy that gets in the way of local control over schools. And this is something that really resonates with far-right conservatives who've been targeting the department for a while, particularly because of their efforts to promote racial equity in schools, increase teacher diversity, and protect LGBTQ plus students. So it's not just about saving money, it's about pushing back against certain ideas and policies.
And the irony, of course, is that the article points out that those very programs, the biggest K-12 funding programs from the department, they're the ones supporting the communities most at risk from these changes.
Absolutely. Those programs the Biden administration got funding for, like, increasing school integration, you got the Magnet Schools Assistance Program, the Fostering Diverse Schools Initiative, they're all facing uncertainty. And then there's the dedicated funding for historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, and those programs to get more diverse teachers in the classroom.
Yeah.
Those are all potentially on the chopping block.
Becky Pringle, the president of the National Education Association, she didn't hold back either, did she?
No, she was very clear. She warned that if they eliminate the department, it would devastate public education. She laid out a whole list of potential consequences. I mean, really scary stuff. Less money for vulnerable students, already overcrowded classrooms getting even bigger, cuts to those job training programs that people rely on, college becoming even more expensive, taking away those vital special education services for students with disabilities, and weakening those civil rights protections that are so important. It's a long and very alarming list.
Yeah, and the article hints that the administration might have even more plans up their sleeve, things that could further destabilize public education.
You're right. There's talk of possibly taking away federal funding from schools, for various reasons. They might push harder for those voucher programs, which take money from public schools and give it to private schools. They could give a lot more money to those private charter schools with less oversight. And then there's that very controversial idea of letting ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, raid public schools, which you can imagine that just creates a climate of fear, especially for immigrant families and their kids.
It's crucial to remember just how many kids rely on public education. I mean, it's the backbone of our education system.
Right, the vast majority. The article says 90% of all U.S. students go to public schools, and for students with disabilities, it's even higher, 95%. Those schools really depend on the Department of Education, both for the funding and for making sure things are run fairly and effectively.
So these cuts and these potential future policy shifts, they could have a ripple effect throughout the entire American education system. Becky Pringle had a very strong quote summarizing Trump's education agenda, didn't she?
Yeah, she called it a wrecking ball to public schools, and she made it clear that the students who would be hurt the most are those who are already marginalized and struggling. She said, and I'm quoting here, "Americans did not vote for and do not support ending the federal government's commitment to ensuring equal educational opportunities for every child." That really captures the strong feelings people have against these proposed changes.
That definitely sounds like there are some big changes coming, and they could have some very serious consequences for our education system, especially for those who are most vulnerable. All right, let's move on to our second deep dive. This one is about the barriers to Black homeownership. And it starts with a really disturbing story out of California.
Yeah, the article tells the story of Sonia Reed, a woman in San Leandro, California. She finally achieved her dream of owning a home in December of 2024, but almost immediately she started facing racial harassment and vandalism. Her neighbors, they were targeting her and her property. It's a really sad story and shows how hard it can be for Black people to become homeowners, even when they finally achieve that goal.
It's just awful. You finally reach this huge life milestone, and then you're met with this kind of blatant racism in your own neighborhood. It's just heartbreaking. And the article makes a point of saying this isn't an isolated incident.
Right. That's the really important thing here. While what happened to Sonia Reed is a very clear and shocking example of racism, it's connected to much bigger issues that go way beyond one individual or one event. The article talks about systemic inequalities that are deeply embedded in our society, the economic challenges that Black families face, and how they're often hit harder by things like natural disasters. All of this makes it so much harder for them to buy homes and build wealth for their families. So we need to look beyond these individual cases and see the bigger picture.
The article mentions a new report from the Urban Institute. What are some of the key findings from that report that have to explain these systemic issues?
Yeah, so the Urban Institute's report found that the rate of home ownership for Black people is still way behind that of white Americans. And their research shows that this gap is the result of decades of discriminatory housing policies. Things like redlining, where neighborhoods, often with mostly minority residents, were marked as too risky for investment, making it nearly impossible to get a mortgage. And then there were those predatory lending practices that specifically targeted Black communities. The Urban Institute says it flat out. Homeownership remains one of the most significant drivers of wealth accumulation, yet Black families continue to face disproportionate and systemic barriers to achieving this fundamental milestone.
So it's not just individual acts of discrimination, it's these long-lasting effects of historical injustices that are still making it harder for Black families to buy homes. The article also talks about the wildfires in Altadena, California, and how that connects to this issue.
Right. Altadena is a community with a long history of Black residents, and they actually have a very high rate of homeownership, 81.5%, which is much higher than the national average. But then those terrible wildfires happened in January 2025 and destroyed thousands of homes. So many families were displaced, and now there's a big worry about gentrification. One resident, James Carter, he said, quote, "Developers circling like vultures. They're afraid that after losing everything, they won't be able to afford to rebuild and stay in the community they've called home for generations." So you see how these barriers to homeownership can have a domino effect, impacting people's financial security and their opportunities in other areas of life.
It's tragic. They're hit by this devastating natural disaster, and then they have to worry about being pushed out of their own neighborhood. The article also shares the story of Brooke Scott in Los Angeles, who faces a different kind of challenge.
Yeah, Brooke Scott, she's a litigation assistant in LA, and she did the math. She figured out that to buy a home and have any kind of financial security in that area, you need to make about $300,000 a year. And she points out that for many Black families, that's just not possible. Housing costs are sky high, plus you've got healthcare, taxes, the cost of raising kids, it all adds up. She said, and this really struck me, the numbers just don't add up. Even with two incomes, we're barely able to put away anything for a down payment.
It's the double whammy, right? The cost of living keeps going up, and the ability to earn enough to keep up just isn't there for so many people. So whether it's dealing with direct racism, the aftermath of a natural disaster, or just trying to make ends meet, the path to Black homeownership is still incredibly difficult. The Urban Institute's conclusion is pretty sobering.
Yeah, they basically said that until we see some big changes, the gap is going to persist. We need to tackle those income disparities, get rid of those discriminatory lending practices that are still out there, and find ways to close that huge gap in generational wealth. They do say that there have been some attempts to address the problem, some federal and local initiatives. But they also warn that without some major policy changes and a lot more investment in Black communities, the homeownership gap will persist for generations to come. It's a pretty strong statement.
And it highlights that underlying feeling, right? Like, despite being a significant part of the population, Black families are consistently undervalued. They work harder, they struggle more, but they get less security, less opportunity to build wealth. And it just shouldn't be that way. The article ends by bringing it back to those individual stories, reminding us that the fight for fair housing and the chance to build a better future is far from over. That quote from James Carter really sticks with you.
Yeah, he just said, we just want what everyone else has, a fair shot at building a future. It's simple, but it's so powerful. Everyone deserves that chance.
It's a powerful reminder that we still have a long way to go. Okay, let's shift gears to something a little more positive. Our third deep dive is about this new debt relief initiative from, of all places, Experian. It actually sounds like it could make a real difference for some people.
Yeah, this is interesting. So Experian is teaming up with a company called ForgiveCo, and they're putting $5 million towards debt relief. The first phase of the program is focusing on 5,000 families in Louisiana, but they're saying they might expand it later on. And they're specifically looking to help people who are struggling with credit card debt and personal loan debt, which, as we know, can be a huge burden for a lot of families.
$5 million, dollars, that's not insignificant. Why would a big credit reporting agency like Experian decide to do something like this?
Well, Steve Hartman, he's the VP of Integrated Marketing at Experian, he said it's about more than just advertising their products and services. He pointed out that consumer debt is at an all-time high, credit card balances are going up, those minimum payments are getting harder and harder to keep up with. So Experian wanted to actually do something to help, to provide some real relief, instead of just talking about financial health in a general sense.
So it's about action, not just words. And what exactly is ForgiveCo doing in all of this?
For Giftco, their job is to find and buy debt that's already in collections. They're doing this specifically for Experian as part of this initiative. And they're really focusing on those families in Louisiana who are having the hardest time financially. Once they've acquired the debt, Experian then notifies the people who are benefiting. They send them letters, text messages, emails, letting them know that their debt has been completely wiped out.
Oh, I can only imagine what a relief that must be. And it sounds like there's even a tax break that comes with this.
Yeah, that's another great thing about the program. Steve Hartman made it clear that the people who get this debt relief won't have to pay any taxes on the amount that was forgiven, so it's even more of a financial boost.
They've also got Flo J. Johnson involved, the LSU basketball star. She's a big advocate for financial literacy, right?
She is. Experian had already been working with her, and given how passionate she is about financial education, and she has a huge platform, especially in Louisiana, it made sense to partner with her on this. She'll be helping to spread the word about financial literacy and letting people know about these debt relief resources.
So she's not just lending her name to the project, she's actively involved.
Right, exactly. Hartman said that she's actually going out and talking to students and people in the community, sharing her own story about how she manages her money, as a young athlete who's also dealing with those NIL deals and all that. She had a great quote about how it's hard to create a winning financial game plan when you are blocked by debt. And that really gets to the heart of what this initiative is trying to do, remove that financial roadblock.
And there's even a little extra incentive tied to LSU's performance in the tournament.
Yeah, for every win the LSU women's basketball team gets in the tournament, Experian is donating an extra $100,000 to the debt relief fund, up to $500,000. So that's pretty cool.
It's like they're turning it into a community event, a win-win for everyone. So on top of wiping out their debt, those families are also getting some extra help, right? Some tools to help them stay on track financially.
Yep. They get a free year of Experian's premium membership, which gives them access to credit monitoring, their FICO score, and all sorts of resources and educational materials to help them manage their money better and avoid getting back into debt.
It sounds like Experian is really trying to go beyond just a one-time fix to give people the support they need for the long haul. Steve Hartman said something about hearing the stories of the people who've benefited from this.
Yeah, he said that getting to hear those stories is one of the most rewarding parts of the whole thing. Each story is different, and it really shows how important this kind of work is, how it can change people's lives.
That's what it's all about. And this isn't their first time doing something like this, is it?
Nope. They did a similar debt relief program before, focused on the Hispanic community. Daisy Yee, the president of Experian Consumer Services, she said that they're really committed to doing this kind of work, providing financial relief to people who need it, especially during tough economic times, and helping them get on the right track financially. And it sounds like they want to do even more of this in the future, target other communities that are struggling.
That's great to hear. And what kind of advice does Steve Hartman have for people who are struggling with debt?
He says the most important thing is to educate yourself about money, to really understand how credit works and how it can affect your ability to do things like buy a home or a car. And he stressed how important it is to start teaching people about finances early on, when they're young adults and just starting out. That's when they can really benefit from that knowledge.
It sounds like a really thoughtful and well-rounded approach. Provide immediate relief, give people the tools to stay on track, and educate them so they can make good financial decisions. All right, let's move on to our fourth deep dive, where we're going to celebrate a remarkable individual, Joyce Richardson, also known as Mother Richardson, from Bakersfield, California. It's Women's History Month, after all.
Right. March is Women's History Month, and we use this time to highlight the accomplishments of women around the world and their contributions to history, culture, and society. The article reminds us of how long women have been fighting for change, from those protests in New York City factories back in 1857 to those big feminist movements in the 1960s and 1970s. They really changed the world.
And while we often hear about those big names, the national and international figures, it's so important to remember the women who are making a difference right here in our own communities.
Exactly. And Mother Richardson is a great example of that. The article tells her story, and it's really beautiful. You learn about her life, her deep faith, and how dedicated she is to her community. She grew up working in the fields with her parents, Kelsey James and Ceola Riggs Hendricks. They were farm laborers. She spent her childhood picking plums, peaches, lettuce, carrots, cotton, onions, alfalfa, sugar beets, you name it.
Wow. Sounds like she learned the value of hard work from a very young age. And it sounds like her faith has played a huge role in her life.
Yeah, a pivotal moment for her. She remembers being introduced to Christ at 10 years old while she was working on the Banducci Ranch. Some pastors were there, Reuben Meeks, T.W. Russaw, and Bishop Evie McGee, and she says she felt a call from God. And that led her and her family to become deeply involved in the St. Paul Church of God in Christ, where she had these great mentors, Pastor Henry and Mother McGee Heyman, and she got involved in all these ministries, youth groups, choir, hospitality, you name it.
It sounds like she was an incredibly active and engaged student as well.
Oh, absolutely. She graduated as the outstanding girl from Lakeside Elementary School and was really into sports, played all kinds of them. Then at Bakersfield High School, she was class representative in all these clubs, Leaders Club, choir, archery, hockey, golf, DELC. She did it all. And she even went on to study nursing at Bakersfield College, always wanting to help others.
But life had other plans, as it often does. Her nursing career got put on hold.
Yeah, she had to take care of her parents and siblings. So she put her studies aside and she was working full-time at Memorial Hospital. The article says it was a really taxing time for her, but she did what she had to do for her family.
And she went on to have a beautiful family of her own.
Yeah, a big, loving family. She got married to Willie Byrd Jr. in 1958. And they had 3 children. Then in 1974, she married Elder Curtis Richardson, and together they created this blended family with 6 children, 16 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. And even with all of that and working full-time, she was so involved in her kids' lives, PTA president, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Bluebirds, Campfire Girls. She did it all, always there for her family.
And her husband's work in their church, that was a huge part of their lives, too.
For 42 years, they pastored the Open Door Church of God in Christ. And Mother Richardson, she was a real leader there, especially in the Sunday school, the women's department, and the youth department. She loved her congregation, and she had a real soft spot for the young people, always mentoring them and guiding them.
And her leadership went beyond just their local church, right?
Right. She's been part of the Church of God in Christ, California Valley jurisdiction since the very beginning, serving under all the bishops and holding all these important positions. Supervisor of the Department of Women, president of the Young Women's Christian Council. She's been recognized and awarded for her dedication all along the way.
And even after she and her husband retired from pastoring, they haven't slowed down, have they?
Not at all. They're now at Holy Temple, Coexic, under Bishop C. Diana Bynum. And Mother Richardson, she's the president of the Sunshine Band. The article says she's loving every minute of it. She just has this incredible energy and spirit.
She's an amazing woman, a true inspiration. What a beautiful story of faith, family, and community. Okay, let's move on to our final deep dive. This one is about the experiences of Black women in the workplace in California. And it's based on a pretty eye-opening report.
Yeah, this report is called Invisible Labor, Visible Struggles, the Intersection of Race, Gender, and Workplace Equity for Black Women in California, and it was put together by the California Black Women's Collective Empowerment Institute, CBWCEI. They surveyed 452 Black women who were employed across California, and the results are pretty telling.
The numbers are pretty stark, aren't they?
Yeah. 60%, that's 3/5 of the women they surveyed, said they had experienced racism or discrimination in the past year, and 57% of those incidents happen at work.
Wow. So basically, most Black women in California are dealing with racism and discrimination, and more than half of them are facing it at work. What's the CBWCEI's take on this?
Kelly Todd Griffin, the president and CEO of CBWCEI, she said it best. Black women are overlooked, underpaid, and undervalued at work, even though they're the backbone of so many communities and industries. And she said something really important, that systemic racism and sexism are not just historical injustices. They are active forces shaping the workplace experiences of Black women today. She called this report a call to action. We need better policies, companies need to be held accountable, and we need to make big changes to fix these deep-rooted problems.
The report talks about the invisible labor struggles of Black women. What does that mean exactly in the context of work?
Basically, it means all the extra challenges and burdens that Black women face because of both racism and sexism, those two things intersecting. The report argues that this kind of discrimination makes it harder for them to get ahead in their careers, to get promotions, to even dream big. It holds them back in so many ways.
So what were some of the things that the women in the survey said? What kind of experiences were they having?
Well, only 21% of them said they felt like they had a good chance of getting promoted at their jobs. 49% said they felt like they were being passed over, excluded, or just marginalized. And almost half of them, 48%, said that their achievements and their hard work were not appreciated, that they were undervalued. It's really sad to hear. And then you've got 38% who said they were seen as the angry Black woman, that stereotype that's so damaging. And 42% said that the racism and discrimination they experienced had actually impacted their physical or mental health.
Those are really tough numbers to hear. But the article also mentions some positive things that the women said.
Yeah, it's important to have the whole picture. 58% said they did feel supported at work, and 52% said they felt like their work was acknowledged, and 49% said they felt empowered in their roles. But even with those positive responses, the fact remains that there are some very serious issues that need to be addressed.
And of course, there's the wage gap, which is still a huge problem, especially for Black women.
Yeah, the report cites another study that found that Black women in California make an average of $54,000 a year. And if you're a Black single mother, it's even lower, around $50,000. Compare that to white men, who make an average of $90,000 a year. That gap is just huge. And think about this. More than half of Black families in California are led by single Black women. So this wage gap has a really big impact on their lives. And they're saying it won't close until 2121. That's just unbelievable.
2121, that's just so far away. It's like we're not even trying to fix this. Glenda Gill from Save a Girl, Save a World, she had a really strong reaction to these findings.
Yeah, she said it shows that systemic barriers still exist and that we haven't made enough progress, especially when you consider that Black women are the fastest growing group of employees and entrepreneurs. They make up 53% of the workforce. She called the situation really disturbing and said the house is on fire at all levels.
It sounds like we need to do a lot more than just talk about these issues. We need to take action. And that's what the report is all about, isn't it? It offers some concrete solutions.
Exactly. They've got a whole list of recommendations, both things that can be done without passing new laws and things that would require legislation. They want to create more opportunities for Black women, hold companies accountable for discrimination, and give them more protection at work. So, for example, they want to make companies with 50 or more employees do annual pay audits where they break down the numbers by race, gender, and job title. And if they find unfair wage gaps, there should be penalties. They also want to create a grant program specifically for Black women entrepreneurs and business owners to help them get ahead in those industries where they face the most barriers.
There are also some ideas about creating a group to study these economic disparities and making it easier for women to report discrimination.
Right. They want to create a state-run economic justice group that would really dig into those long-term economic disparities and come up with policy recommendations. And they want to make it easier for women to report discrimination by creating independent review panels that can look at those claims fairly.
The report really emphasizes that these proposals aren't just empty gestures, they're about real change.
Absolutely. They want to go beyond those symbolic gestures and performative DEI efforts that don't really do anything. They want to see bold intersectional policies that put Black women's economic security, their dignity at work, and their leadership opportunities front and center.
Kelly Todd Griffin seems optimistic that these proposals can actually make a difference.
She does. She thinks that those accountability measures built into the solutions will help to guarantee economic security and fair wages for Black women. She said, "This data gives us the opportunity to make sure Black women in California experience what everyone else experiences in California. I don't know why we wouldn't be able to achieve that." It's a powerful statement, and it speaks to that core desire for equality. And she also makes a great point about how when you improve conditions for Black women, you're really improving things for all women. Because so many of the issues they face, they're shared issues. And, as she put it, Black women still represent all of California.
It's a powerful reminder that we're all in this together. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at potential big changes coming to our education system, the ongoing struggles for Black home ownership, an effort to help people get out of debt, a celebration of an amazing woman who's dedicated her life to her community, and a deep dive into the inequalities that Black women are facing in the workplace. It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's all connected, right? We're seeing how government decisions, those big policy shifts, can have a ripple effect on everyday lives.
Uh,
We're seeing the fight for equity in so many areas, from housing to the workplace. And we're seeing how individuals and organizations are trying to make a difference, to create opportunities, and level the playing field.
it really makes you think. So we want to leave you with this question. What does all of this tell you about where we are as a society right now? And what role do you see yourself playing in shaping a more just and equitable future? Maybe it's about supporting those organizations that are fighting for change. Or maybe it's about having those tough conversations with your friends and family. Or maybe it's about educating yourself and making sure you're using your voice and your vote to advocate for the things you believe in. Whatever it is, we encourage you to reflect on these stories, on the connections between them, and on what you can do to make a difference.
It all starts with awareness, right?
Yeah,
Understanding the issues, the complexities, and then figuring out how we can all be part of the solution.
exactly. Thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.